Welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank for this opportunity to Fordham University and Center for Jewish Studies. I also want to thank the hardworking staff of the Jewish Division at the New York Public Library, and thanks everyone who came. There is no better way to start this week than by talking about Soviet Jewish history. And I am here to talk about this immigration. It's a very big topic, so we cannot cover everything. So today I will focus mainly on Soviet Jewish identity and how this identity was seen in the United States. So, a light topic, but the fun part is that we're going to use all these stories. And with that, I will start. So, I'm afraid that here we can expect some confusion. Okay. Some of our new American friends asked us about our Jewish experience in the Soviet Union, and they asked us, were you persecuted because you practice the Jewish religion? The Russian Jews understand our being Jewish not from the point of view of practicing our Jewish religion. There, being Jewish means belonging to some Jewish native family, some people with the same kind of blood that have some kind of interesting traditions, and perform them. Perform them because they are traditional for us. This is not really practicing religion. Alexander Meistel summarized the most apparent characteristics of Soviet Jewish identity. It is well documented by now between the Soviet and post-Soviet Jewish identity, the ethnic identity, the Yevrei, and Jewish religious affiliation, the Yudai, became distinct. Religious customs and traditions, like once central to Jewish life, were pushed to the margins in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was an anti-religious country, and the Soviet experience had a lasting impact on the Soviet Jewish history as well. And Jewish identity was officially categorized as an ethnicity, a nationalnost, and with the introduction of the internal passport in 1932, it was recorded like in the infamous fifth line, and a child's ethnicity was noted based on their parents, although children from mixed marriages could choose their own ethnicity. And the dismantling of Jewish cultural and religious institutions, along with the Soviet passport system, reinforced an ethnobiological view of this identity. And so many describe this identity as belonging to the people, like with the same blood. Like a lot of interviewees said this all the time, that we have the same blood, entirely separate from religion. And Soviet Jews in the 1970s found themselves in a unique position. They were permitted to leave the Soviet Union under the pretext of family reunification in Israel. And between 1971 and 1980, around 245,000 people emigrated. In the first years of this emigration, nearly all immigrants went to Israel. But starting in 1973, a growing number of immigrants chose to bypass Israel, their final destination, and resettled in the United States, instead a trend known as the dropout phenomenon, or the Nashira in Hebrew. And by the end of the decade, the number of dropouts, the Noshrim, had reached 65,000, making them the majority, as more immigrants were now settling in the United States than in Israel. So this wave of immigrants found themselves caught between two worlds. The Soviet Union, where their identity was also a state-imposed label in the passport, and the West, where their Jewish identity was questioned through a Western cultural framework. So this is the decade also where scholars and just everyday people in the West discovered Soviet Jews in flesh and blood. But before that, they could only read about them, only in books. And researchers produced so many studies in the 70s and 80s that relied heavily on surveys and statistical analysis. And these reports concluded that Soviet Jews associated their Jewish identity with negative connotation due to the anti-Semitism. They had little knowledge of traditions and defined themselves ethnically. But in his oral history testimony, Alexander also pointed out that they practiced certain interesting traditions, as he called. But these traditions upheld by Soviet Jewish immigrants were often overlooked in the West, where observers primarily focused on the decline of religious identity and the lack of fundamental knowledge of Jewish customs, instead of the persistence of certain Jewish practices. And so this is in the 70s and 80s, like people in the West failed to ask what Soviet Jews themselves considered Jewish. And in 1979 and 1980, the American Jewish community interviewed 160 immigrants in 25 cities spread in the United States between 1973 and 1980. So this work is based on this oral history collection. And it not only shows the unique Soviet Jewish experience, but also their everyday lives. They focus on like Jewish identity, anti-Semitism, living conditions, the cultural and political oppressions, the financial situations, the immigration process, first impressions in the United States. And based on the answers, you can also get a glimpse into the mental history of these immigrants. So they talk about like the meaning of kultura or the kulturnost, like cultureness in the Soviet Union. They were highly class conscious people, and so on. And these people had a lot to say. And they wanted to tell their stories and wanted to be seen as they saw themselves. But as it turned out, that their self-image and how they were seen in the West were not the same. And in the interviews, a common question was like, did you feel Jewish in the Soviet Union? Typical responses included that, how could I forget? They always reminded us. It was in our passport. So the first reaction to feeling Jewish in the Soviet Union was always almost a negative memory. For example, like Galina asked, when she was asked, like, what did you understand about what makes a person Jewish? Her response was, a lot of troubles at first. You know, I did not have many troubles myself. I mostly saw them around me. I know it's hard to study at some institution if you are Jewish. And Emanuel Bobrov was an example of this. He struggled to gain admission to university. He graduated high school with a gold medal, which in the Soviet educational system guaranteed admission without an entrance exam. So he just needed like an informal talk with the committee, but when he showed his passport, it was all over. So he was rejected by 3 different universities. So as he stated, that was the first time I started to feel that I was Jewish. And another example, that Jesvir Saperson stated she didn't feel Jewish as strongly as her husband because she had light hair. And as she said, the greatest compliments I used to receive from my close friends who were very well educated were that I didn't look Jewish. And then she recounted an incident in which her husband was involved in a physical altercation after 2 men called him Jew. That was the pejorative term for Jews in the Soviet Union. And this led her to recall another experience. Her daughter, whom others perceived as Slavic-looking, a view she disagreed with, struggled to find a job after being required to present her internal passport. So she concluded her story with her decision to quit her job and the advice she received against it because Jews were never hired anymore. So in her testimony, feeling Jewish became a series of negative memories for her family. And so these responses reflect the findings in the existing literature regarding the relationship between anti-Semitism and negative Jewish identity in the Soviet Union after World War II. They frequently encountered both popular and state-sponsored anti-Semitism later in life, especially during critical moments such as applying for higher education, a PhD program, trying to find a job or getting a promotion. And their parents, who had not faced such challenges in the past, had to watch their children struggle with these barriers. And many were able to assist, lacking the connections needed to influence such decisions. So these situations became particularly difficult during like the Black Years. That's the period between 1948 and 1953, the last years of Stalin, who launched new waves of anti-Semitic campaigns, and after the Six-Day War. So after 1967, Soviet propaganda no longer differentiated between Zionism and Jews, and the two terms became effectively interchangeable. As you can see, some horrible cartoons. So after the Six-Day War, Zionism or Israel was usually portrayed as a spider, a snake, an octopus, or even as a Nazi soldier. So, and these answers also suggest that feeling Jewish in the Soviet Union was predominantly linked to the public sphere, where Jewish identity was a state-imposed category marked in the internal passport. But the private lives of these people reveal a different narrative. Oral histories indicate that the positive expressions of Jewish identity primarily shifted to the private sphere, where individuals cultivated meaningful connections with family and friends. So deprived of cultural and religious institutions, and with limited knowledge of traditions due to systematic repression, many Soviet Jews found real meanings in their private lives. Interviewees frequently emphasized the stark contrast between their public and private personas, often likening it to a split personality experience or leading a double life. This aspect of Soviet life was commonly noted as one of the most unbearable parts of the daily existence, having to publicly express one's sentiment while privately believing the opposite and continuously maintaining a facade of deception and insincerity toward the government and state. So in this environment, private life was seen as the only space for authenticity. And to fully understand Jewish identity in the late Soviet period, viewing public and private experience as interwoven is crucial, because together they defined the lived reality of Soviet Jews. Oral history testimonies reveal the positive association or expressed through actions such as family traditions, serving Jewish food, placing a strong emphasis on education and hard work, following the careers of Jewish artists and scientists, possessing banned books on Jewish and Israeli history, observing holidays without fully understanding their origins, and fostering a sense of cultural pride, sometimes even a sense of superiority. The interviews, structures, and questions were shaped by the American Jewish framework, which primarily, once again, emphasized religious observance and synagogue attendance, practices that were not central to Soviet Jewish life. Individuals could only share their stories because they were in the United States, but this new environment eventually shaped not just the narrative, but also the American understanding and interpretation of Soviet Jewish life. For example, Boris was asked whether he believed that American Jews cared about being Jews more than Soviet Jews. His difficulty in engaging with the question underscores how Soviet Jewish identity could not be easily measured by American standards. He replied that, "I don't understand the question." So they elaborated that, well, do you think that American Jews are more religious people in comparison to Soviet Jews? Do they observe Jewish holidays, keep kosher, and so on? And he replied, of course they can keep kosher, they can be religious. In Russia, it is forbidden. Kosher food you will never get. First time I heard about it here. For another example, now Madovoy was asked if he received Jewish education at home. And his response was, what do you mean by Jewish education? He explained that they did not have a Bible and it was impossible to get one. As he said, no Jewish history or prayers or Yiddish or religion. I knew it existed. When I grew up, I knew it existed and I knew my grandmother believed in it, but not us. And the last example, Martin Farkas was asked if he had become more observant religiously since coming to the United States. His answer was simply a no, but he added that he wanted to learn more about his culture, though he was currently focused on learning English. So these answers did not align with the expectations and the American understanding of Judaism. At the same time, the questions did not reflect the experiences or priorities of Soviet Jewish immigrants. The mismatched expectation and disconnect often result in the misunderstanding of Soviet narratives, But the interviews still provide like valuable insights into how Soviet Jews express their identity, which must be analyzed, within the Soviet context rather than through American lens. And these expressions of identity vary significantly from person to person. And just to see a few examples, Boris Kazansky said his grandfather, who had once been a cantor before the Russian Revolution, shared stories about Jewish history with him. He described his parents as like true Soviet people, yet Passover was their annual family holiday. Trained as an opera singer, Boris received an offer from the Moscow Philharmonic on the condition that he changes his family name, as it was deemed impossible for a singer to have a Jewish surname. He chose the name Kazansky, which was derived from his birthplace, reasoning that it was clear to the audience that it was not a real name. So his compromise was clear, like he changed his name, yet ensured that the unusual surname would still signal that he was not Russian. In the United States, he worked as a cantor, partly as a tribute to his grandfather. Alexander Factor shared a piece of Jewish wisdom, as he called, he learned from his mother and never forgot. To achieve success and secure a good profession, he had to be better than everyone else. He believed that following this advice was why he excelled as a student, consistently earning top marks, and that it also made him successful professionally. Elena Tsipkin was influenced by her grandmother, who taught her to read Yiddish. She said that she got pretty Jewish when she lived with her. They ordered matzah, and her grandmother baked traditional Jewish foods. She described her mother as deeply Jewish in both identity and appearance, emphasizing that she felt Jewish, looked Jewish, and acted Jewish. This characterization highlighted her mother's commitment to family and the distinction from the Russian people. In the United States, while she did not attend synagogue frequently, she visited during the high holidays, fasted on Yom Kippur, and abstained from eating pork. And the last example is Yefim Cherniakovsky. He was a high school physical education teacher. He described Jewish children as intelligent, but generally less skilled in sports. He attributed this to Jewish family traditions where children were cared for and encouraged to read or play the piano instead of engaging in physical activities, according to him. He also observed that while few Jewish athletes were in the Soviet Union, Jewish representation was stronger in chess. It again points out to the fact that Jews are very intelligent people and less inclined toward physical efforts, like he remarked. So these few examples show how Soviet Jewish individuals try to keep and express their identity, and surveys and statistics do not capture these stories, but documenting them is crucial, as this method of expressing Jewish identity was prevalent in the diaspora. And unlike Americans, of course, freely visit synagogues, they were familiar with history, the dietary laws, they could support Israel without fear of political backlash, they could read, Chaim Potok or watch Barbra Streisand portraying Jewish characters. Post-Soviet Jewish expression of identity might seem deficient for them. But in the Soviet context, where anti-Semitism was prevalent and being Jewish as an ethnicity was often evident due to the passport, these actions had much greater significance. For individuals who chose not to risk political harassment by participating in protests or refusing activism, a decision made by the most, these acts became the primary means of expressing their identity, and Jewishness in the Soviet Union operated under entirely different conditions. It existed within a society that simultaneously imposed and suppressed it. And in the post-war Soviet Union, this is what Jewish meant for them. And another important aspect of this dynamic is, as the example shows, the diaspora continued to identify as Jews in the United States. Although negative associations often influenced the initial feelings about being Jewish in the Soviet Union, the lack of state-sponsored anti-Semitism and the internal passports abroad did not cause them to abandon their identity. Instead, they preserved the late Soviet ways of expressing it in the new surrounding. So therefore, all these stories are very important They show us the private daily lives, and they must be understood as integral to their sense of identity and how they navigated in both in the Soviet Union and beyond, and should not be overlooked. And resettlement agencies soon become concerned about the attitude of the illegal right migrants. They typically identify the most important aspects, focusing mainly on its religious dimension or lack thereof. And this emphasis was not coincidental. Between the 1950s and 1970s, like American Jewish life underwent a profound transformation marked by social mobility, entry to the middle class, suburbanization, and a revival of synagogue-centered Judaism. Between 1945 and 1965, 1 out of every 3 Jews left the big cities for the suburbs, a rate higher than other Americans. The suburbs facilitated the formation of new centers as Jewish schools enrollment more than doubled between the end of World War II and the mid-1950s. And the most common expression of Jewishness in suburbia was membership in synagogue. And synagogue affiliation jumped from 20% in 1930 to 60% in 1960. And so on. You all know about these changes better than me. I'm not from the United States. But we have to register them. Like, these changes also affected the image of Soviet Jews who arrived into this environment. And all of these indicate that for many Soviet Jews in the post-war period, like visiting a synagogue in the United States was perceived as a political act and an expression of resilience rather than a basic part of Judaism. Synagogues increasingly took on political significance as the Jewish movement gained visibility in the 1960s and 70s, and testimonies reveal that synagogues became information centers for the immigration process, with some even noting that Russian men who were nearby to find Jewish women to marry and emigrated. There is a book, The Jokes of Oppression, Soviet Jewish Humor. It came out in 1988. And one of the authors actually interviewed in this collection. And I found jokes about Jewish women being like an international passport. This type of wife hunting was less likely, but it was evident that Soviet authorities closely monitored such attendance, which could jeopardize an individual's professional career and expose them to state repression. So consequently, many immigrants visited the synagogue for the first time arriving in the United States. And despite rejecting the Soviet system, these individuals who emigrated were still shaped by the environment in which they were born and raised. They were not entirely unaffected by the influences present in this upbringing, where religion was often perceived as a backward tradition. And their limited understanding of Hebrew and often even English made religious services seem remote and alien, like they had no idea what to do, like get up, turning around, nothing. So they recognized the synagogue's central role in Jewish life, but the interviewees stressed that they were not religious. So consequently, they typically attended synagogue only during the high holidays, a pattern that ironically mirrored the practices of increasing number of American Jews in the 1970s. And one of the motivating forces behind the Jewish Agency's commitment to helping resettle Soviet immigrants was their hope that these individuals would develop a strong American Jewish identity, they participate in American communal life, and their children would embrace American Jewish life. And a report from the Soviet Jewish Resettlement Program in the 1980s offers further insights into this approach. It delivers a more sober and self-critical analysis, but still operating with the established narrative framework. The report outlined a recommended strategy for engaging with Soviet immigrants. They wanted to present cultural Judaism as a viable alternative, as they called it. But the report acknowledged that promoting cultural Judaism as an option arose partly from the reasons such as eligibility for federal grants for religious programs. The report also addressed several issues, including the lack of commitment to Jewish life among Americans, which was something they aimed to change in the Soviet immigrant community. And this point is crucial, I think, as the report noted that Lastly, the Soviet Jew often arrives in a community where the average American Jew is not very committed. He has little Jewish education, and his children have even less. He rarely, if ever, attends synagogue, and when he does, it tends to be for social reasons rather than spiritual ones. He is not active on any committees and contributes minimally to Jewish institutions, if at all. It probably doesn't take long for the immigrant to understand the level of commitment and identity among average American Jews in many of our communities. In fact, in most communities, we should be able to use the more established immigrant community as a mirror for ourselves as Jews. If the Soviet Jews disappoint us, it may be we who are disappointing. End of quote. So, since Soviet Jews were interpreted through the experience of American Jews, the criticism directed at them also reflected the challenges faced by the American Jews at the time. The earlier mentioned rising number of synagogue affiliations was not accompanied by religious observance or passion. It did not mean weekly service attendance, eating only kosher food, or having a serious interest in Jewish intellectualism. By 1979, the percentage of Soviet Jewish individuals marrying non-Jews in the US rose to 36%. A trend started in the 1960s. Surveys also indicated that the increasing percentage of Jews who did not identify as Jewish by religion across generations. So during these transformative decades for Americans, like assimilation increased and religious observance waned, they faced diminished anti-Semitism and attained greater economic and social standing. So in this context, the hopes surrounding Soviet Jewish immigration did not match expectation. But the oral histories also show that Soviet Jews had their own narratives, their own stories, their own problems, which was very different from the American ones. And Alexander Meistel offered his perspective on the American situation. Like he said, that Russian Jews are extremely illiterate about Jewish history when they come from the Soviet Union. In Rome, they are informed in an organized manner about Israel's history. But nobody has anything with Judaism, Jewish history, their being, Jews, customs, nothing. We are illiterate in this way, okay? Then we come here, we find out that many members of our American community are also illiterate. There are serious shortcomings in Sunday school education and American Jewish education. The great Russian author Lev Tolstoy learned Hebrew to read Jewish books, and we don't teach our kids. It's no good. I think I will overcome this resistance. Similarly, like Hannah and Lazar Bedelis, a married couple from Lithuania born in 1919, were less than impressed. Due to their age and place of origin, they had a stronger connection to Jewish traditions and the Yiddish language than most of the emigres in the oral history collection. As they put it, they had a Jewish life and described interwar Lithuania as a little Israel. They spoke Yiddish at home, ate kosher food, observed all holidays, attended Jewish schools, and had almost no contact with Lithuanians. They chose the United States as their destination solely because their son was already there and persuaded them to go instead of immigrating to Israel. And Hannah was a bit pessimistic about her new life. As she said, I thought I would come here and somehow manage financially, but that we would find a cultural life without question. Her husband said, of course you can find cultural life here, but you have to know English. But I want Jewish culture. Jewish cultural life here is English. I already know I won't be able to speak English, so I will have nothing. The twist in Alexander's story is that he was among the minority in the immigrant community who became more engaged in American Jewish life than an active member. But as he delved deeper, he grew dissatisfied with the perceived lack of commitment to Jewish life within the American Jewish community. And in her interview, like Hannah not only criticized the more assimilated people from Russia and Ukraine, but also expressed disappointment with American Jewish culture. She argued that Jewish culture, as she defined it through Yiddish and keeping the traditions, did not exist in the United States. Unable to rediscover the culture she had lost and grappling with the language barrier, she ultimately concluded that there was no Jewish culture in America. She was not right, obviously, but the point to her story that to her, assimilation was not an option, like neither in the Soviet Union nor the United States. So why Soviet Jews were often perceived like as not Jewish enough, on American soil. Like American Jews were judged similarly when they encountered the more active members of the American or Soviet Jewish community. So there was another shared similarity between the two groups, the criticism of the disappearing Jewish distinction due to assimilation and the lack of commitment to religious life. And these immigrants were not only not Jewish enough in the United States, but they were also seen as like too Russian. The American perception of Soviet Jews influenced by the idealized memories of the shtetl and inspiring stories of refusnik, like contrasted sharply with the experiences of the immigrants. Americans quickly discovered that Soviet Jews were neither like heroic Natan Sharansky nor Tedjes from the vanished shtetl past. Instead, like everyday Americans met everyday Soviet citizens, like Bob, the manager, welcomed Galina, the engineer. Like that was the story. So their Soviet lives and like their ordinariness like defied these stereotypes. And the use of Russian language, familiarity with Russian culture, preference for community gatherings rooted in Soviet traditions, like such as celebrating Russian New Year's Eve, made their like this perceived Russianness particularly noticeable. And the immigrants, they prioritized education and professional status over synagogue attendance. Many preferred European and Russian high culture over American, and they wanted to preserve Russian cultural heritage alongside Jewish tradition for their children. So this cultural mismatch led to another disappointment, like reinforcing the perception that Soviet Jews were more Russian than Jewish. And additionally, they did not embrace the shtetl past, which had become romanticized in American memory, and the shtetl emerged as a common reference point for Soviet Jews, American Jews, and resettlement agencies, yet each group interpreted this shared history differently. What they had in common was a limited understanding of the shtetl life, as the complexity of Eastern European Jewish life was often reduced to a one-dimensional narrative. And in contemporary post-Soviet Jewish identity, the memory of shtetl is gradually fading, but the process started here, like in the Soviet era, because Soviet Jews, they distanced themselves from the shtetl life as they took pride in their education, urban culture, and social mobility, all of which became possible with the lifting of restrictions after the Russian Revolution. Interviewees frequently reflected on the shtetl lifestyle, often distinguishing between the shtetl residents, they called them like uneducated people, and their own more urbanized and professional identities. Like Nathan Schiller here, he constantly referred to his family's shtetl background, especially in contrast to his wife's educated, urbanized upbringing, as she was also interviewed. And those who born in the 1930s and 1940s were among the biggest consumers of Russian culture, having been heavily exposed to a Russocentric environment of the Soviet Union. Like Evgenia Adlavinka was a typical example of this. Like she wanted to preserve Russian culture and not Soviet culture for her children. And this mindset reinforced the perception that they were at their core Russians. But this experience was one they encountered for the first time in their lives in the United States. As Martin Farkas shared the following, that when they thought of you as an immigrant, did they think of you as a Russian? Yes. Is that unusual for you too? Oh, it's very unusual. You know, we are always joking. We are joking, you should leave Russia to become a Russian, because in Russia we are Jews and here we are Russians. So regardless of the personal feelings about their Jewish identity or the extent to which they expressed in the Soviet Union, they saw themselves as Jewish people. They were constantly made to feel that they were not Russians and they could never truly be Russians. Harry Orlov's story illustrates this dynamic very well. Orlov was the son of a Jewish mother and a Russian father. At age 16, when he received his internal passport, he had to declare his ethnicity. Following his family's advice, he chose to register as a Russian to avoid future problems. And he later reflected that he lived his life according to his passport designation. However, in 1971, he discovered a long-hidden family secret. It's always like that. His father was Jewish and lied about being Russian. So this revelation brought all of a sense of enlightenment, offering him an explanation for feelings of otherness that had long shaped his life. As he said, and so that was how I learned quite recently that I was 100% Jew, which was a rather strong shock for me. But I have to say that I had the idea. I'm not sure how correct I was in this, but continually sensing the differences, contradictions, and lack of mutual understanding between myself and my colleagues, often even with people very close to me, people with whom I couldn't trust and whom I respected, some sort of difference in temperament, in quality of mind, in the manner of thinking, and it seemed to me, and I tried to explain it in this way to myself and to others, that in some way this was connected with my Jewishness. So to understand his Jewish identity, although sought to define it through cultural and national traits, he listed the Jewish temperament, the ability to view oneself with irony, the differences in family dynamics between Russians and Jews and education and upbringings. And his story underscores how in the Soviet Union, Russian and Jewish identities were perceived as mutually exclusive. And in 1976, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society published a book for newly arrived immigrants to help them navigate their new lives. Interviewees mentioned this book, stating that they received in Rome. It offered a brief introduction to American and Jewish history, along with tips for daily life. And it also clarified that an individual can be both American and Jewish, which was a whole new concept for these immigrants. Like they had to learn this. And the book also offered tips for self-labeling. The book said that maybe they could call themselves Soviet Jews. But this was a label that they did not like, actually. Stories from the 1980s showed that Soviet Jews largely rejected being labeled as Russian, instead primarily identifying as Jewish. And the term Russian Jew was favored over Soviet Jew. And the distinction between Russian and Soviet Jews during the Cold War may seem subtle, but the semantics carried profound meanings for these immigrants. Like many emphasized the desire to preserve Russian culture by distancing themselves from Soviet ideology. And the emigration represented a break from the Soviet past, and they chose to leave behind it in pursuit of a better future. And the connection to Jewish identity persisted even as the new life began. I will stop here because I think our time is up. So just one short conclusion. I think we can say that Soviet Jewish identity represented a valid and an independent response to life under an oppressive regime. And this identity did not dissolve with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead, it evolved into a transnational Russian-speaking Jewish diaspora that maintains deep roots in the Soviet cultural experiences rather than conforming to Western models. And maybe you are thinking that what is so special about Soviet Jews practicing Judaism? Because it might sound familiar these days now. So once seen as not Jewish enough, the American Jewish identity has come closer to the post-Soviet one rather than the other way around. And oral history showed that Soviet Jewish immigrants maintained the peaceful narratives about their past identity, immigration itself. They were not only a reflection or a mirror, like they were a valid expression of Jewishness. Thank you so much.